today we have here with us Giancarlos Larocca. Giancarlos is a global category manager at Tetra Pak, and he will be talking to us today about opportunities in immunity boosting. So really just to introduce very briefly the topic, and then I'll pass the mic to Giancarlos. Of course, with COVID, we've seen a rising trend in the market for demand from consumers of product categories, really, especially in beverage, but also food, around immunity boosting products, really. And so Giancarlos today will be talking a little bit from the vantage point of Tetra Pak, who's of course very deeply embedded in the beverage industry, and specifically he will be discussing these trends that they've seen in the market. So just a couple of housekeeping items. This session will last roughly 25 minutes or so. We'll have a short Q&A session at the end of it. So if you do have any questions, please do use the Q&A feature on Opin. You will find it in the side tab. And with that, it is my pleasure to pass the mic to Giancarlos.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for joining. As mentioned, if we go to the next slide and we kick off right away, we will be talking about opportunities in the immunity boosting segment. I'm going to be talking about especially food and beverages, which is the business where we operate in Tetra Pak, but still you will see many more opportunities also for other things within immunity boosting. So happy to also check your questions at the end and see how further we can expand. If we go to the next slide, thank you, Tommaso, for the introduction. Maybe I will just add that I belong to the central marketing team in Tetra Pak. As mentioned by Tommaso, I work as a global category manager with the specific food and beverages categories. But then we have this specific topic which goes cross categories. And actually we call this a platform. Immunity boosting, we call it a platform because you will see that it goes across categories. I'm based in Italy, in Modena. But before that, I have some job experience in Americas, in the Americas cluster, especially in Latin America. And as mentioned, we will be talking about the immunity boosting topic or platform. And this is it's a very interesting topic, not only for Tetra Pak, but for many players in the industry, because it's not fully developed at the moment, and we will see some of that. But anyhow, we see many opportunities, especially because due to COVID, everything that has been accelerated due to COVID. In the next slide, we will see the agenda. We will be having 3 main blocks. So we will be talking about a little bit understanding, let's say, what's the correlation between immunity boosting and health. So it's not about medical. It could be, but it's not only about medical. It's more about health, which is a broader topic or umbrella for immunity boosting. Then we will be talking a little bit also about consumers. We have some very nice and interesting insights from a consumer point of view to think about solutions and think about products as well for the markets. And finally, I will show briefly a little bit about the Tetra Pak solutions that we have in place, and we will end up with the Q&A at the very end. If we go to the next slide, please. So I don't want to make this a COVID presentation at all. I think we're all very familiar and aware of COVID, of course. But I would just like to say what has been the COVID impact when we talk about immunity boosting opportunities, or the search of having a better immune system overall from a consumer point of view. Then what you see on the left side of the slide, it's the consumer's priorities before COVID, and then you have the new picture after COVID on the right side. And the size of the bubble refers to the prioritization or the importance of each one of those priorities for consumers. Let me give you an example. Convenience, of course, before COVID was had a huge relevance when it comes to consumers' priorities, especially because we were spending a lot of time out of home, a lot of time on the go, out of home, busy lifestyles, and so on. So convenience was very, very important. With COVID, during COVID now, we see that convenience, it's still there, of course, it's a priority for consumers, but then the relevance for convenience has changed because then we're spending more time at home, and also because there are other priorities that are actually gaining more relevance. And one of those priorities, it's actually health and wellness. When we see health and wellness before COVID, we see it had a big relevance still. It was probably within the top 3 priorities for consumers, but now we have seen that bubble expanded due to the COVID implications and the COVID impact. And this is, of course, expected considering that we're living in a pandemic. And this is also the big umbrella, as I mentioned before, for the immunity boosting opportunities, because then we're not talking about the medical area only, which could be very specific, but at the same time, opportunities there could be very limited. Instead, we're talking about the health umbrella, where then we will have much more opportunities also for food and beverages players within the industry as well to capitalize on. In the next slide, if we go to the next, we will see from a consumer point of view, we know, all of us as consumers, we know that this is a trendy topic. We keep hearing about immunity boosting, about new launches regarding immunity boosting. And this is just to give you a flavor of what has been happening when it comes to Google searches, what has been happening online. So we see that people, it's looking every time more about things regarding immunity boosting online. And there you have the figures for specific queries that have grown significantly. So we see things such as immunity boosting and the immunity boosting and the health or the gut health system, or how to overall improve the immune system, and so on. And below on the bottom, you have we have checked the Google Trends just to illustrate a little bit what has been the interest over time. And we see that this topic has gained a lot of interest, and we actually see a peak at the beginning, and it corresponds more or less to the beginning of the lockdown last year. So that's the time where it got up the higher peak. It actually reached 100% according to Google Trends. But even though right now it's not at its maximum, let's say, it's still at very high level, around 40% and stable. So we can say that this is still a trendy topic. It was since last year, and it's still a trendy topic when it comes to consumers looking for opportunities or solutions to boost or protect or enhance their immune system. In the next slide, we asked ourselves, what's the approach that consumers take when it comes to immunity boosting? And there are actually mainly 3 different approaches that we have identified. And these approaches are not exclusive. So we can see the merge of these approaches. We can see consumers actually having this multi-approach on these different and different dimensions and levels that we see here in the slide. So number 1, and this is actually the biggest approach that we see among consumers, it's that they approach immunity boosting from a food and nutrition point of view. So food and beverages, nutrition overall has a major role when it comes to protecting, enhancing, and boosting the immune health. The second approach, it's then a holistic approach, let's say, considering healthy lifestyles. So what can we do to have a better night's sleep or improve the relaxing time that we have, or working out, exercising more, so on and so forth. And finally, the last approach, it's actually the supplements. This is the smaller approach, let's say. Around 25% of the population could use supplements to boost the immune system. Well, when we talk about food and nutrition, it's about 75% of the population. So there is a big gap between food and nutrition and the other 2 approaches. But still, again, there could be the multi-approach. So as mentioned before, these 3 are not mutually exclusive, but then you can have a multi-approach from a consumer point of view. In the next slide, if we go to the next slide, we will have more data points regarding what's happening with immunity boosting. Now zooming in food and nutrition. So I'm going to be focusing on food and nutrition, food and beverages, of course, again, because this is also the area where we operate within Tetra Pak. So we know that this functional drinks has been there. That's not something new. We have been hearing about functional drinks for a while, but then we see more interest in functional drinks, for example. As we can see in the data points here, 61% of consumers are actually concerned about the physical state or fitness scenario that they have at the moment. Well, on the second point, 44% of consumers are considering immunity boosting claims to be appealing in different products, or 48% of consumers are looking for products to improve, for example, the gut health and digestion, which has a very clear connection and link with the immune system. However, the implications, it's clear. I already mentioned the growth on functional drinks, for example, but then the insights that we have there in the lower part are actually quite interesting. So we see a holistic approach to health. That's number one. So it's not only problem solving, but it's also taking a full holistic approach. Also, we see the use of specific ingredients, and this is another big opportunity from an ingredients point of view. Ingredients that have functional and specific benefits to boost the immune system. And the last one, it's actually that we have mentioned that this trend was already here, kind of a little bit, but COVID has accelerated the full trend and the full opportunities for immunity boosting. However, we see this to stay in the future. So it's not a fad, it's actually a trend from all the forecasts that we're doing regarding immunity boosting opportunities. If we go to the next slide, please. Always talking about food and nutrition, we're under food and nutrition. The other behavior, let's say, that we see within immunity boosting, it's that it is expanding to many categories, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's a cross-category platform. That's why we refer to immunity boosting as a platform. And however, there are some specific food and beverage categories where we see more launches for immunity boosting products. And that's what we're trying to show here in the bars. So you see, for example, baby food with about 10% of the launches for that period of time were including an immunity boosting claim. And closely to baby food in the amount of launches, in the percentage, it's also dairy, especially fermented drinks. Again, we talk about the connection between the gut health and immunity boosting, but also juice drinks. And this one, it's also easy to understand because we usually have in top of mind the benefits from fruits and from juice drinks, vitamin C, different vitamins, micronutrients, so on and so forth. However, you see on the right part, other two categories. You see water, for example. So we see also some claims on immunity boosting for water categories. And overall, what we see is that this platform or these opportunities are actually expanding into other categories, into many categories, actually, food and beverage categories. And we expect these to actually gain relevance and even every time more awareness. And every time we expect to see more launches when it comes to immunity boosting in different categories. If we move to the next slide, please. Again, on food and beverage, we will talk a little bit about consumers in a second, but now let's talk about briefly on the liquid, on the content, on the actual food, on the ingredients. So we have mapped, let's say, 4 different and major groups. These are not, of course, the only ones, but are the most relevant ones at the moment, where we see different ingredients or group of ingredients playing a major role when it comes to immunity boosting solutions. Number one, it's micronutrients, where vitamins and minerals fall, for example. The second one, it's herbal and botanics ingredients. These ones are very interesting also because they provide exciting flavors, but also they have very clear functional benefits. The other one, going clockwise, it's proteins, of course. That one, I think it's quite clear. And then the last one is probiotics. Actually, I'm going the opposite of the clock. Probiotics, I close with probiotics. Again, we have mentioned the correlation between gut health and the immune system. Probiotics, it's also an interesting one. We have seen many things around biotics, probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, but let's say overall biotics as an ingredient for products covering the immunity boosting opportunities. In the next slide, we will talk about consumers a little bit. We have some insights regarding consumers. And if we move to the next slide, we have asked ourselves, are consumers all the same when it comes to immunity boosting? We saw already the approaches, the different approaches consumers are taking, but then are all consumers the same? And the clear answer, is no, as any marketer would know. So there is a different segmentation when it comes to consumers, and we have found 4 different groups when it comes to consumer segmentation approaching immunity boosting from a consumer point of view again. If I go in order, this time, yes, I will go clockwise. We have the exploratory type. Then these ones tend to be the trendsetters, are the ones that are actually eager to try new things, new ingredients, new products regarding immunity boosting, of course, but they also show high interest on it. And usually they are well informed about the benefits, about the ingredients, so on and so forth. Then we have the problem solving type. And those ones are actually approaching immunity boosting only when they have specific issues or specific problems or specific things that they want to solve when it comes to health. One example of that is consumers that approach immunity boosting products only on winter because of, I don't know, flu or things like that, or because of COVID. But after COVID, these consumers probably will go out or will go away from immunity boosting solutions. So it's a very problem solving approach. And then they're looking for specific needs, and therefore they're looking also for effectiveness of the benefits that are promised within those solutions. Then we have the holistic type. This is one type that it's growing. I mentioned before the holistic approach overall. And then they try to have a preventive approach instead of a problem-solving approach. And they incorporate the healthy practices regarding immunity boosting into their lifestyles. So it's not a punctual connection with immunity boosting, but it's more integrated into the lifestyle. And the final one, it's traditional, the traditional type. And this is actually the bigger segment. And here we have the classic approach. These people tend to use homemade recipes, homemade preparations. This is also coming from family recommendation, for example. So the recipe is coming from the grandmother or the grandfather. So they have a very strong approach to immunity boosting solutions, but they do it on a traditional way. And they rely a lot on traditional ingredients or ingredients that are well known for their benefits when it comes to immunity boosting. I mentioned that this is actually the biggest group. However, the smaller group, but it's the one setting the trend, it's the exploratory one. And in the middle, we would have, in the middle of that sandwich, we would have the problem-solving ones and the holistic ones. So there you have the full spectrum of consumer segmentation when it comes to immunity boosting. If we go to the next one, please. Now, so far, it should be clear what consumers are looking for, more or less, when it comes to immunity boosting solutions, but it's still worth mentioning what consumers are actually trying to avoid or not looking for at all. So number one, it's labels that are not clear or that are not showing real data, real benefits. They're looking more in the look and feel. They're trying to look good, but at the end they don't have specific benefits or real benefits. Also, formulations that are high on sugar. This is something that comes very clear and strong from a consumer point of view. They're trying to avoid a little bit the sugar intake or limiting the sugar intake, but also they're trying to avoid any kind of trade-off. That's it. They don't want to, I don't know, have high protein, but also high sugar. So that's a trade-off that, for example, consumers don't want to do. And finally, they want to have claims that are also understandable and not difficult or hard to believe, that are over-promising to some extent, and also packaging that it's not sustainable. It's something that consumers are actively trying to avoid when it comes to immunity boosting solutions. Then in the next one, let me summarize. We have, if we move to the next one, Tommaso, please. Great. Let's see the three main takeaways that we have. So number one, we have mentioned the COVID impact, and definitely it has put the spotlight on immunity boosting solutions, but then functional drinks and functional food has been there for a while. It just gained a lot of more traction and speed due to COVID, and we expect this to stay in the future, as I mentioned before. Number two, there are many lenses, as you saw, to look at immunity boosting, and that there are different opportunities depending which lens we use, but definitely there are different demographics we could approach. There are different attitudes when it comes to consumers. There are different ingredients, different formulations. So there are many opportunities and therefore also many lenses to look at those opportunities when it comes to immunity boosting. And finally, I have mentioned briefly, but also one key point, it's also about the positioning and communication from a company point of view, but also from a brand point of view, because we need to rely on the way we communicate the key benefits and the functional benefits and the key ingredients from the solutions in the case of food and beverages in order to promote the immunity boosting solutions and also build awareness or grow in awareness. And this is also an area where technology could support for sure. Then before moving into the Q&A, let me just briefly mention, if we go to the next slide where we have the Zig Zag, let me just briefly mention before moving into the Q&A what we do in Tetra Pak. So we use this approach of relying on many, let's say, methodologies. One of those, it's lean startup, for example, just to mention one, but also design thinking. That was the one that I was thinking about, agile methodologies as well, and many others. And we have put together this co-creation process where we actually co-create with our customers. And there are many stages in this process. We have been using this also for immunity boosting. So we start with that diagnosis. We move into then a discovery phase to learn about the topic, to be inspired, to get as much information as possible. Then we go through ideation, for example, to create solutions. We used synthesized insights for those solutions that we create for those ideations. We land into specific new products or services. So it's not necessarily on only products, it could be also services. And finally, we have the evolution phase where we measure and share the learnings in order to have this continuous improvement in mind for the full process. And the other key thing from a Tetra Pak point of view in the next slide, it's this capability that we have. We call this customer innovation centers, but also product discovery centers or product development centers, where then we led some part of the Zig Zag of the process that you saw before. And these centers that are the best environment actually to drive innovation with our customers, in this case for immunity boosting. Now we're running, of course, some of these processes and methodologies also online. So when we say that this is the best place and the best environment, we don't mean only the physical place, but we're moving also into the digital area in order to use our capabilities both on the product development centers and the customer innovation centers with the Zig Zag that we saw before. And with that, then I think we can open the floor for the questions as much as we can. And I hand over to you, Tommaso.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giancarlos. So if anyone has any questions, please do type them in the Q&A box. In the meantime, I do have one. So you mentioned several times how immunity boosting really is a cross-category platform. You mentioned a few categories where you've seen these really coming to the market, really, with baby food, dairy or juices. Then you mentioned a few that are maybe a bit farther away in the future, like plant-based and water. Is there any other categories where you're expecting growth, significant growth in the immunity boosting kind of segment? And kind of what are you thinking about? What are your thoughts about kind of new categories coming to the space?
Right. So just to mention a couple, again, it's across categories. We see it now. We see it growing in many categories. We can also mention soups, for example. That's one that was not in the slide, but it's another area where we see immunity boosting solutions growing. But then, of course, we have another area which is very specialized on nutrition. We call that area specialized nutrition. So we see also this when we say baby food, we also expect this to happen, for example, in baby and toddlers milks, for example, or medical food, again, under the umbrella of health instead of the medical or pharmaceutical umbrella, which is fine. It's just a little bit smaller, of course, and much more specific. But when we talk about medical food, we also talk about things that could be used, and I don't want to mention any brand, but things that are approaching the health or the medical spectrum from a health point of view and not necessarily from a medical point of view. That's another one that it's very specific and it's very linked to immunity boosting, of course. That's another one where we expect to see growth. But then overall, the key message is exactly that. We don't see this limited only to one specific category. And as we innovate with different ingredients, different formulations, so on and so forth, we will be seeing also some categories blurring. That's also something that we could forecast, and it's also happening already with some categories for some other topics. So category blurring could also be happening for immunity boosting, and we expect that for the future.
A lot of sense. So thanks, Carlos, for that answer.
Sure.
I have another question on my side. So you mentioned a couple of times also the fact that this is not really a fad, of course, that COVID really brought it to the fore, but it's here to stay. And you actually pointed to the fact that you've done a bunch of research on this to corroborate this. Maybe if you can share kind of some details about kind of what your thoughts are with kind of where immunity boosting is going, hopefully after we get out of COVID.
Sure. So the way we see it, it's something that, as I mentioned, and you said it correctly, it will stay. So we don't see this only as a COVID situation. COVID has some impacts for sure and has accelerated it completely. But then it will stay. For sure, it will stay. The evolution that we see then, or the innovation coming forward, it's then, as I mentioned before, ingredients and formulation, looking at functional benefits, clear functional benefits. That's number one. And the other evolution that we see moving forward, it's also on the communication part. Because right now, awareness, it's not that high. It, of course, depends on which country we're talking about. But then we also expect technology, let's say, to leverage on the capabilities to provide more or a better communication in order to increase the awareness when it comes to immunity boosting solutions. The other thing that we could mention is that there are many recipes, homemade recipes, and we talk about the traditional approach and the traditional type. As we go back to busy lifestyles out of home, because they're now actually busy at home probably, but if we go out of home every time more now, with the vaccines and so on, we also expect to have more ready to eat or ready to drink solutions. So we expect part of those traditional consumers moving into something that it's more holistic maybe, or indefinitely not only at home made, but also for on the go. So something that it's ready to eat or it's ready to drink, that's another shift that we're forecasting, let's say, or that we expect to happen. And overall, I would say one of the major focus, as mentioned, it's formulation. So many things on ingredients, many things on specific benefits, many things on communication, as mentioned before. Those are kind of the things that we are expecting to see. Plus, of course, what we mentioned before, this growing in other categories. That for sure, it's something that we're actually working on actively to expand. Water, as mentioned before, it's one of those, plant-based as well, soups. So we don't talk only about drinks, but we also talk about food. So we forecast also expanding into other categories.
That makes a ton of sense. And then if we still have time for one last question, also my side. So you mentioned earlier, that there's a few things that consumer effectively are not looking for in immunity boosting kind of product categories.
Correct.
You mentioned, for instance, a lot of sugar in the products, or the wrong kind of packaging. How do you make sure, though, that brands that do choose to pursue new product categories with immunity boosting claims do not do the equivalent of greenwashing only for immunity boosting? Kind of how can brands communicate with trust that their product categories enhance immunity?
Sure. So I think there's a direct link between the ingredient, the key ingredient, sometimes we call those hero ingredients, for example, and the benefits, right? In the sense that are these ingredients providing the specific benefits. And every time I think consumers are more aware and actually more demanding and are more informed as well, or at least wanting to know more about the provenance, for example, about the processes, about the sustainability regarding the product as it is, so on and so forth. So I think it's not only coming from an industry point of view to have that clarity, let's say, or that consistency when it comes to immunity boosting launches and solutions, but also I think we have a strong push from consumers and a demand from consumers on being completely clear and avoiding having any kind of greenwashing at all, because otherwise I'm sure it won't be successful with consumers. And then depending on which consumers we're targeting, then we saw before that specific consumers are actually looking for having the specific benefits happening. So they need to have the proof that the benefit it's there. So once the benefit doesn't appear, it's not happening, that's the place where we will lose the consumers. So we're completely against, of course, having something that it's not completely consistent. And therefore, again, communication, it's going to be key in the way to provide and convey those messages, the right messages, increase awareness, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Giancarlos. This was very insightful. So thank you for this presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the participation.
Absolutely. And this concludes today's masterclass with Giancarlos Larocca from Tetra Pak. And with that, thank you all for having joined.